Long before the clash of swords and the roar of battle cries, the stage was set in a land of rugged landscapes, dense forests and rolling hills, a land that had witnessed countless skirmishes, raids and territorial disputes over generations. It was in this unforgiving environment that 800 Norsemen would soon face a seemingly insurmountable challenge, a massive enemy force of 40,000 warriors. To modern eyes, the disparity in numbers appears suicidal, yet for the Norsemen such odds were not unfamiliar. Their lives had been forged through hardship, from the frigid fjords of Scandinavia to the violent coastal raids across Europe. Survival required resilience, cunning, and an intimate understanding of both man and nature. The Norsemen, often painted in myths as barbaric raiders, were far more than simple warriors driven by greed and bloodlust. They were a people steeped in tradition, bound by loyalty to their chieftains and clans, and motivated by a code of honor that demanded courage in the face of death. Their society emphasized physical prowess, strategic thinking, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. In a conflict such as this, sheer numbers mattered little if those soldiers lacked discipline, cohesion, and a clear understanding of the terrain. The opposing army, on the other hand, was a force of overwhelming size, drawn from a coalition of neighboring kingdoms, eager to crush the Norsemen once and for all. At 40,000 strong, they represented not just a military threat, but the collective might of political power and ambition. Their commanders relied on the certainty that such numbers would intimidate and quickly subdue the smaller force. They expected the Norsemen to break under pressure, to scatter like leaves in a storm, and to be crushed under the weight of a tidal wave of steel. Confidence ran high among the enemy ranks, fed by their experience in conventional warfare and the presumption that the Norsemen could not possibly withstand such a siege. Yet numbers alone do not win battles. The Norsemen understood this truth better than most. Their history was filled with tales of impossible victories where small bands of warriors used guile, speed, and intimate knowledge of the land to destroy far larger forces. These were not mere stories of luck, they were lessons etched into the collective memory of every Norse child and warrior. From a young age they were trained to fight in close formations, to wield axes and swords with precision, and to endure both physical pain and mental strain. They knew that every man mattered and that unity was their greatest weapon. The context of this particular clash was also shaped by geography. The battlefield was chosen with careful consideration. It lay near a narrow valley flanked by thick forests and steep hills, a terrain that could nullify the numerical advantage of the enemy. The Norsemen knew that fighting in open plains would spell disaster. Their small numbers could easily be encircled and annihilated. Instead, they prepared to use the land itself as an ally. Hidden positions in the trees, uneven ground, and choke points would allow them to strike selectively, ambush enemy detachments, and create confusion among ranks that relied on size rather than strategy. In essence, the battlefield would become an extension of the Norsemen's tactical mindset. Beyond geography, timing played a crucial role in the context of the battle. The Norsemen were not simply confronting a larger force, they were doing so at a moment when the enemy was overconfident and complacent. Intelligence had reached the Norse chieftains that the opposing army, while large, was composed of poorly coordinated contingents. Many of the troops were inexperienced conscripts, their loyalty tenuous and their morale fragile. The commanders of the Norsemen understood that the perception of strength could be manipulated and that fear could spread faster than any sword could strike. By choosing the moment to engage carefully, they ensured that psychological factors would weigh heavily in their favor. Furthermore, the cultural and religious undertones of the conflict added another layer of intensity. For the Norsemen, battle was not merely a contest of arms, but a spiritual endeavor. They believed in the guidance of their gods, the favor of Odin in the fray, and the honor that awaited warriors who fell bravely. This belief infused every action with purpose and courage. For the enemy, while motivated by conquest and political ambition, the scale of the battle and the sheer unfamiliar ferocity of the Norsemen were likely underestimated. They faced a force that fought not only with weapons, but with the unyielding will of a people for whom retreat was tantamount to dishonor. In this context, one can begin to understand how 800 men might challenge 40,000. The battle was as much a confrontation of wills as of weapons. The Norsemen relied on speed, intelligence, and cohesion, while the enemy leaned on size and presumed inevitability. Every moment leading up to the clash was a study in contrasts, confidence versus experience, preparation versus complacency, unity versus dispersal. It was a lesson in how careful planning, knowledge of the land, and mental fortitude could amplify strength, turning what seemed like an impossible scenario into a battlefield where the improbable could become reality. Ultimately, the context of the clash underscores a timeless truth of warfare: numbers alone are not decisive. Discipline, strategy, leadership, and terrain can magnify the power of a smaller force. The Norsemen's ability to confront an overwhelming army and emerge victorious was not an accident. It was the result of centuries of cultural refinement, tactical innovation, and the unshakable belief in their own capabilities. By understanding the context of this battle, one begins to appreciate the genius behind their actions and the magnitude of what they were about to achieve. Before the first arrow was loosed and the first shield clashed, the stage was set. The Norsemen, 800 strong, stood ready against 40,000 adversaries, embodying a perfect storm of courage, strategy, and destiny. The world would soon witness how preparation, intellect, and spirit could overcome sheer numbers, forever etching this clash into the annals of legend. The courage of the Norsemen was legendary. But courage alone could not overcome an army 50 times their size. What turned the tide in their favor was a combination of meticulous strategy and exceptional leadership, two qualities that were inseparable in Norse warfare. The 800 warriors who faced 40,000 enemies did so under commanders who were not only fearless in battle, but also deeply intelligent, capable of analyzing the enemy, the terrain, and the human mind itself. Every decision, from the placement of scouts' the timing of a charge, was calculated with precision. It was leadership that transformed a small band into a near unbeatable force. The foremost element of their strategy was the organization of the troops. Unlike the sprawling, loosely connected enemy force, the Norsemen moved as a single cohesive unit. They formed shield walls, a defensive formation that created a virtually impenetrable barrier of interlocking shields. Each man was trained to maintain the integrity of the wall under the most extreme stress. Behind the wall, seasoned warriors with spears and axes waited, ready to strike when the moment demanded. This was not mere defense. It was a tactical posture designed to channel enemy aggression into predictable avenues where the Norsemen could exploit it. Leadership in the Norse ranks was also about delegation and specialization. The chieftains understood that even within a small army, roles had to be defined. Some warriors were assigned to hold the line, others to flank the enemy, and yet others to serve as mobile reserves who could reinforce weak points or exploit sudden openings. Scouts and lookouts provided constant intelligence, reporting enemy movements and highlighting vulnerabilities. This division of responsibilities allowed the Norsemen to act with flexibility and foresight, while their enemies, despite their numbers, often moved clumsily, unable to respond to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Another critical aspect of their strategy was surprise. The Norsemen deliberately avoided fighting in predictable ways. They utilized deception, feints, and ambushes to disrupt enemy formations and sow confusion. Warriors would hide in the forests or on ridges, waiting for the right moment to descend upon enemy detachments. In some cases, they simulated retreats, drawing the enemy into precarious positions where the terrain worked against them. These tactics capitalized on the enemy's overconfidence, turning what should have been an overwhelming advantage into a liability. A force of 40,000, confident in its size, was suddenly caught off guard by attacks from multiple directions, each perfectly timed and executed with brutal efficiency. Leadership was not just about strategy, it was also about morale. The Norse commanders were masters of instilling courage in their men and fear in their foes. They inspired loyalty not through fear of punishment, but through the promise of honor and shared glory. The warriors trusted their leaders implicitly, knowing that every command was grounded in experience and careful planning. In contrast, the enemy troops, drawn from diverse regions and lacking the same unity of purpose, were far more susceptible to panic. The Norsemen understood that battles are often won or lost in the minds of men. A disciplined, confident army can hold its ground against a larger, disorganized force. By keeping their men motivated and focused, the leaders ensured that morale would never falter, even in the most intense moments of combat. Communication was another area where Norse leadership excelled. On a chaotic battlefield, signals of every kind, horns, flags, shouted commands, were used to coordinate movements. This allowed the Norsemen to adapt instantly to changing circumstances, reinforcing weak points or exploiting gaps in enemy lines. In contrast, the massive enemy army, with its countless contingents, struggled to maintain cohesion. Delays in relaying orders, misunderstandings, and hesitation caused breakdowns that the Norsemen were quick to exploit. Leadership in this sense was about creating order out of chaos, using intelligence and foresight to make every movement count. Timing was perhaps the most decisive factor in their strategic approach. The Norse commanders knew that engaging the enemy by too early could expose their weakness, while waiting too long risked giving the enemy time to adjust. They studied the movements of the opposing army carefully, understanding when morale was lowest, when their lines were stretched thin, and when terrain could be used to maximum effect. This patience allowed them to strike at the exact moment when their small numbers could achieve maximum impact, turning the initial numerical disadvantage into an unexpected advantage. The Norse strategy also relied heavily on adaptability. They did not follow rigid battle plans. Instead, they were prepared to adjust in real time. If an enemy flank advanced too quickly, reserves could be redirected to counter the threat. If a choke point became congested, small units could maneuver to block or ambush the enemy. Every man was trained to understand not only his role, but the overall strategy, allowing the army to function like a living organism, responding instantly to new threats and opportunities. Such adaptability was nearly impossible for the much larger enemy force, whose size made coordination slow and mistakes costly. Finally, the Norsemen's strategy incorporated psychological warfare. Their leaders understood that fear could be weaponized. By attacking suddenly, using loud war cries, and displaying ferocity beyond expectation, they intimidated enemy troops before a single sword was even swung. This created hesitation, disrupted formations, and lowered morale. The psychological edge amplified the effectiveness of every tactical maneuver, demonstrating that leadership was not solely about commanding troops, but about understanding the human psyche. In sum, the Norsemen's victory was a triumph of strategy and leadership over numbers. It was the result of disciplined organization. Specialized roles, clever use of terrain, surprise tactics, effective communication, timing, adaptable, and psychological mastery. Their leaders orchestrated every aspect of the battle with precision, ensuring that each warrior's actions contributed to the larger plan. Against 40,000 opponents, these qualities turned 800 men into an unstoppable force. The Norsemen did not merely fight. They choreographed a symphony of violence, each movement deliberate, each strike purposeful, and each decision guided by the wisdom of experience. This section of the story illustrates that great leadership can defy the odds. While courage and physical skill are vital, the ability to think strategically, inspire loyalty, and manipulate the battlefield can turn even the smallest force into a legend. The 800 Norsemen who faced 40,000 enemies did so with intelligence and discipline as their weapons, proving that the mind can triumph over numbers and that a well-led army, no matter how small, can leave an indelible mark on history and warfare. No factor is more decisive than the battlefield itself. The Norsemen, fully aware of their numerical disadvantage, knew that victory would not come from brute strength alone. The land around them, the hills, valleys, forests, and narrow passes, would become their most valuable weapon. For the 800 Norse warriors, understanding and exploiting terrain was as critical as their swords, axes, and shields. Every slope, every river bend, and every dense thicket was studied, remembered, and integrated into a comprehensive plan designed to maximize their advantage and minimize the impact of the enemy's overwhelming numbers. The battlefield was not chosen at random. The Norse chieftains, drawing upon generations of local knowledge, selected a site that would naturally restrict the enemy's ability to maneuver. A narrow valley, hemmed in by steep hills on either side, served as a natural funnel. The massive army of 40,000 could not spread out into a full formatio without becoming congested and vulnerable. What would normally have been an overwhelming advantage, sheer numbers, became a liability. Instead of attacking in coordinated, large-scale formations, the enemy was forced to advance in smaller, disorganized groups, making them easier targets for the disciplined Norse warriors waiting in ambush. The hills flanking the valley provided more than just strategic funneling. From elevated positions, Norse archers and javelin throwers could rain destruction upon the enemy below, striking before the enemy could close the distance. Each hill became a natural fortress, providing cover and a commanding view of the battlefield. Norse warriors, trained to fight in both open and uneven terrain, used these heights to devastating effect, launching projectiles that struck panic into the enemy ranks and softened them for close-quarters combat. The psychological effect of arrows falling from above, often appearing suddenly from hidden positions, compounded the confusion and fear among the attackers. Forests and thickets on the outskirts of the valley further enhanced the Norsemen's tactical advantage. The enemy, confident in their numerical superiority, expected an open confrontation. Instead, they encountered sudden ambushes from concealed warriors who would strike swiftly and disappear back into the trees. These guerrilla-style attacks inflicted chaos, disrupting formations and slowing the enemy advance. The dense foliage not only hid the Norsemen, but also forced the enemy to move cautiously, preventing them from taking full advantage of their numbers. By controlling the timing and placement of attacks, the Norse warriors dictated the pace of battle, forcing the enemy to react to them rather than initiating their own strategies. Rivers and marshy grounds near the battlefield added yet another layer of tactical complexity. The enemy, UNF, familiar with the local geography, struggled to navigate these natural obstacles while maintaining formation. Crossing a river or marsh under attack could turn into a deadly trap. The Norsemen, by contrast, knew every shallow crossing, every firm bank, and every hidden bog. They lured parts of the enemy force into these hazardous zones, where movement was slowed, formations broke apart, and morale faltered. In essence, the terrain became a force multiplier, allowing the smaller Norse army to control engagements that would otherwise have been suicidal. The strategic placement of the Norsemen in relation to the terrain was deliberate and precise. Shield walls were established at choke points where the enemy could only attack in limited numbers. Archers and javelin throwers occupied higher ground or forested flanks, while mobile reserves remained hidden, ready to exploit any breach or pursue fleeing troops. This distribution allowed the Norsemen to strike at the enemy piecemeal, defeating them in smaller, manageable engagements rather than being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The battlefield, in essence, was transformed into a series of controlled zones, each carefully defended and utilized to maximize the efficiency of their forces. In addition to physical advantages, the Norsemen leveraged the psychological impact of terrain. The enemy, advancing into narrow passes flanked by hidden warriors and under constant projectile fire, became increasingly anxious and confused. Panic spread faster than combat could. Soldiers who might have fought bravely on an open field found themselves trapped, uncertain of the source of attacks and unable to coordinate with their comrades. The Norsemen understood that fear could be as effective a weapon as any sword. By using the landscape to manipulate perception and disrupt cohesion, they amplified their smaller numbers into an apparent and terrifying force. Even natural obstacles, such as rocks, fallen trees, and uneven ground, were turned to advantage. The Norse warriors were trained to move swiftly across difficult terrain, using it to shield movements, set traps, or funnel enemies into kill zones. Every step the enemy took became precarious, while the Norsemen moved with confidence and precision. These subtle but consistent advantages wore down the enemy, exhausting them physically and mentally before the decisive clash even began. The Norsemen also employed the terrain to execute complex tactics rarely seen in conventional warfare. Ambushes were timed with precision, and signals, horns, flags, or even prearranged noises coordinated multiple attacks across different areas of the battlefield. For instance, a small detachment might provoke an advance from one enemy contingent, driving them into a narrow valley where another group of Norsemen awaited. The terrain, combined with careful timing and coordination, allowed 800 men to inflict maximum damage with minimal exposure, gradually eroding the much larger enemy force. Ultimately, the terrain became more than just a backdrop, it was a weapon in its own right. It magnified the Norsemen's strengths, mitigated their weaknesses, and turned the enemy's advantage into a vulnerability. The careful selection of the battlefield, the strategic use of hills, forests, and rivers, and the intelligent positioning of troops all worked together to level the playing field. The 800 Norsemen were not merely reacting to their environment, they were orchestrating it, bending the landscape to their will and shaping the flow of battle before a single clash of swords. By the time the enemy realized the full scope of what they were up against, it was too late. Disorganized, exhausted, and demoralized, their numerical superiority counted for little against an army that had stared every inch of the battlefield. The terrain, once passive, had become active, an integral part of the Norse strategy and a decisive factor in their improbable victory. In conclusion, the Norsemen's use of terrain and tactical advantage demonstrates that size alone does not determine the outcome of war. Knowledge, preparation, and adaptability can transform obstacles into weapons and turn a desperate situation into an opportunity. By turning the battlefield itself into a force multiplier, the 800 Norse warriors created conditions under which even the most formidable enemy could be defeated. The interplay of landscape, strategy, and human skill turned what might have been a slaughter into a legendary triumph, a lesson in the power of terrain and tactical ingenuity that resonates through history and warfare. The mind is often the most fragile weapon. The Norsemen understood this truth better than most armies in history. Facing 40,000 enemies with just 800 warriors could have been a recipe for despair. Yet the Norsemen turned psychology into a weapon as deadly as any sword or spear. Their leaders knew that victory would depend not only on physical strength and tactical positioning, but also on their ability to manipulate fear, perception, and morale. The battlefield is as much a theater of the mind as it is of blood and steel, and in this domain the Norsemen excelled. From the moment the enemy first glimpsed the Norse warriors arrayed in their formations, the seeds of psychological warfare were sown. The Norsemen's approach to intimidation was deliberate, ritualized, and terrifying. They used loud, piercing war cries designed to unsettle even seasoned soldiers. The sounds were more than noise. They were signals of aggression, confidence, and absolute fearlessness. These cries, amplified by the echoes of the valley and hills around them, gave the illusion of a far larger force than it actually was. From the enemy's perspective, they were facing a storm of fury that seemed infinite, a wall of noise, rage, and unyielding aggression. Weapons themselves became instruments of psychological terror. The Norse axes, swords, and spears were not just tools for killing, they were symbols of the warrior's lethal intent. They were polished, raised, and swung with a display of force designed to intimidate the enemy before combat even began. The sight of disciplined warriors in perfectly coordinated shield walls, ready to unleash destruction, reinforced the perception of an indomitable force. The enemy, though larger in number, began to doubt whether sheer size could overcome such resolute organization and ferocity. Deception was another critical aspect of psychological warfare. The Norsemen understood that perception often dictates action on the battlefield. They used feigned retreats to draw enemy forces into traps, creating confusion and panic. Small detachments might appear to flee in disorder, only to lure larger enemy units into ambushes in narrow valleys or dense forests. These controlled retreats played on the natural fear of being outmaneuvered or surrounded, causing hesitation and disorder among enemy ranks. By exploiting the human instinct to pursue a retreating foe, the Norsemen converted enemy aggression into a liability. The timing of attacks further amplified psychological pressure. The Norse warriors struck when the enemy least expected it, often from hidden positions or flanking routes. Sudden assaults from above or behind, combined with the noise and chaos of battle, created the sensation of being besieged from all sides. Soldiers who might have faced a frontal assault calmly now found themselves unsure where the next blow would come from. This unpredictability eroded confidence, slowed their advance, and left them vulnerable to smaller, concentrated Norse attacks. The larger the enemy, the more difficult it was to maintain cohesion, and the Norsemen exploited every crack in the armor of fear and confusion. Leadership played a central role in sustaining morale among the Norse warriors themselves. Unlike their opponents, whose numbers could not guarantee loyalty or bravery, the Norsemen relied on tight bonds of trust and shared purpose. Chieftains led from the front, demonstrating personal courage and resilience. The sight of a leader charging alongside his men, unflinching in the face of danger, inspired a sense of invincibility. Warriors fought not only for victory, but for honor, reputation, and the collective pride of their clan. This unwavering confidence was infectious. It countered fear, reinforced discipline, and ensured that the smaller force remained cohesive even under extreme pressure. The Norsemen also utilized visual intimidation to reinforce psychological dominance. Shields, armor, and weaponry were often arranged to maximize visual impact. Lines of warriors moved in synchronized formations, giving the appearance of a single massive entity rather than individual combatants. Warriors painted their faces or adorned themselves with symbols of ferocity, further enhancing the impression of supernatural strength and fearlessness. From a distance, the enemy could not easily discern the actual number of combatants, and every movement seemed deliberate, coordinated, and overwhelming. The psychological effect was profound. Soldiers confronted not just an army, but an aura of invincibility. Even the physical environment was weaponized for psychological effect. The Norsemen used hills, forests, and rivers to create the impression of being everywhere at once. Projectiles rained from hidden positions, warriors appeared suddenly from flanks, and the enemy could never be sure of the strength, or location, of the opposition. The uncertainty, amplified by the roar of battle cries and the sudden clamor of combat, eroded the enemy's mental fortitude. Confusion became a force multiplier, making their numerical advantage nearly irrelevant. Fear, of course, can turn to panic if left unchecked, and this is exactly what the Norsemen sought to induce. Panic is contagious in any army. Once a small group hesitates or flees, neighboring units begin to question their own courage, and cohesion rapidly collapses. The Norse warriors deliberately targeted units most likely to break first, creating a chain reaction of disorder. Every success reinforced confidence among the Norsemen while accelerating the unraveling of enemy formations. By controlling the psychological flow of battle, the Norsemen dictated not only what happened on the field, but also how the enemy perceived their own chances of survival. Morale, however, was not just about instilling fear in the enemy, it was also about sustaining courage in one's own ranks under extreme stress. The Norsemen trained rigorously for both physical endurance and mental toughness. They were accustomed to harsh winters, grueling journeys, and relentless raids. This conditioning meant that the shock of facing vastly superior numbers did not break them. Rituals, oaths, and shared stories of legendary warriors reinforced resilience. Each man understood that retreat was dishonor, and honor was inseparable from survival in both life and legend. This mental fortitude ensured that when the enemy wavered, the Norsemen remained steadfast, turning the psychological edge decisively in their favor. Ultimately, the battle became a contest of wills as much as a contest of arms. The Norsemen used fear, confusion, unpredictability, and disciplined courage to create a psychological battlefield in which 800 men could dominate 40,000. By contrast, Ling perception, exploiting human instincts and reinforcing internal morale, they transformed themselves from a small, outnumbered force into an embodiment of unstoppable fury. When the enemy finally realized the true scale and skill of their opposition, it was often too late. Panic, disorganization, and fear had already set in, leaving them vulnerable to the precise and brutal strikes of the Norsemen. In conclusion, psychological warfare and morale were as decisive as axes and shields. The 800 Norse warriors did not simply fight with weapons, they fought with their minds, turning fear into an ally and discipline into a weapon. The art of war, as they demonstrated, is as much about mastering human perception and morale as it is about physical combat. Through intimidation, deception, leadership, and shared purpose, the Norsemen proved that even against impossible odds, the mind can triumph over sheer numbers, making their victory not just a physical achievement, but a psychological masterpiece that resonates through history. When the dust of battle finally settled, and the echoes of war cries faded into the valleys, the scale of the Norsemen's victory became immediately apparent. Against all odds, 800 warriors had faced an enemy of 40,000 and emerged victorious. The aftermath of the battle was both chaotic and telling. The battlefield was strewn with the remnants of a shattered army, abandoned weapons, broken shields, and the bodies of soldiers who had succumbed to the Norsemen's strategy, skill, and psychological mastery. The Norse warriors, though fatigued and battered, remained organized and disciplined, a testament to the cohesion and leadership that had carried them through the impossible ordeal. The immediate consequences of the battle were both practical and symbolic. Practically, the Norsemen had secured their territory and ensured the survival of their clans. Each enemy's defeat halted their advance, disrupted their command structure, and left surviving soldiers in disarray. Many fled in panic, unable to regroup after the psychological blows inflicted during the battle. The victory allowed the Norsemen to consolidate their power, rebuild their defenses, and prepare for future conflicts from a position of strength. But beyond the tactical outcomes, the symbolic impact was even more profound. The battle became a legend, a story of how intelligence, discipline, and courage could overcome staggering odds. It would be told for generations, shaping the cultural identity of the Norse people and inspiring future warriors. The legacy of the battle was deeply intertwined with the Norse understanding of honor, reputation, and storytelling. In a society where deeds in combat defined a warrior's standing, the triumph of 800 men over tens of thousands elevated those involved to legendary status. Bards and skalds recounted the battle in sagas and poems, emphasizing not just the heroism of individuals, but the strategic brilliance of their leaders. These narratives reinforced values central to Norse culture: courage in the face of danger, loyalty to one's clan, and the importance of wisdom in warfare. The battle thus became more than a military achievement. It was a cultural touchstone, a reminder that intellect and bravery could shape history. The Norsemen's victory also sent shockwaves beyond their immediate region. Neighboring tribes and kingdoms, previously confident in their ability to overwhelm small forces, began to reconsider the threat posed by these disciplined warriors. Tales of 800 men defeating 40,000 spread far and wide, fostering both fear and respect. The psychological impact extended long after the battlefield was cleared. Enemies who had once dismissed the Norsemen as mere raiders now recognized them as formidable strategy, capable of leveraging terrain, morale, and cunning to devastating effect. This newfound reputation acted as a deterrent, ensuring that future engagements would be approached with caution and respect. The aftermath of the battle also revealed the human cost of such a confrontation. While the Norsemen emerged victorious, their own losses were not insignificant. Every man had fought to the limits of endurance, and the physical and emotional toll was immense. The survivors bore witness to the horrors of war, the lifeless bodies of friends and foes alike, the scars of wounds sustained in brutal close-quarters combat, and the psychological strain of facing impossible odds. Yet, these sacrifices were woven into the narrative of glory and honor that defined Norse warfare. In their society, the courage to stand and fight against overwhelming numbers was celebrated, and those who survived were revered not only for their skill, but for their fortitude. Strategically, the battle had lasting implications for the art of war itself. Military historians and contemporary leaders alike have studied the Norse victory as a case study in asymmetric warfare, illustrating how small, disciplined forces can defeat much larger opponents through intelligence, preparation, and ingenuity. The use of terrain, psychological tactics, and coordinated strategy became central themes in the analysis of this battle, offering lessons that transcended time and geography. In many ways, the encounter exemplified the timeless principle that in war, human ingenuity and leadership can outweigh sheer numerical superiority. Culturally, the battle reinforced the Norse ethos of resilience and courage. Songs, poems, and sagas immortalized the deeds of individual warriors and the brilliance of their leaders. These stories were passed down orally for generations, becoming integral to the collective memory of the people. They emphasized not just victory, but the values that had made victory possible: preparation, unity, discipline, and unwavering courage. The battle thus became a narrative tool, teaching lessons in strategy, morality, and personal honor to those who would follow in the footsteps of the Norsemen. The long-term legacy also extended to enemy forces. Tribes and kingdoms that had witnessed or heard of the battle became wary of underestimating smaller, highly organized forces. Military planning began to take into account factors beyond numbers alone: terrain, psychological readiness, and the discipline of opposing troops. In this way, the battle influenced not only the Norsemen's own history, but also the broader evolution of warfare in the region. It became a benchmark for understanding how to balance size against strategy, courage against caution, and psychology against physical force. Ultimately, the battle demonstrated the enduring truth that heroism is not measured by numbers, but by the ability to act decisively, intelligently, and courageously in the face of overwhelming odds. The Norsemen had turned potential annihilation into a defining moment of triumph. Their victory was celebrated not merely as a military achievement, but as an embodiment of the qualities that defined their society: bravery, skill, wisdom, and unity. This combination of tangible success and symbolic resonance ensured that the story would endure long after the warriors themselves had passed, inspiring future generations to value strategy, courage, and the mastery of both mind and body in the art of combat. In conclusion, the aftermath and legacy of this improbable victory serve as a testament to the power of preparation, leadership, and psychological insight. The Norsemen's triumph over 40,000 enemies was not only a turning point in their own history, but also a lesson to the wider world that intellect, courage, and unity can overcome even the most daunting numerical disadvantage. The battlefield may have been cleared, but the story of 800 men defying impossible odds lived on, becoming a legend that transcended time and geography, forever cementing their place in history as warriors whose skill, strategy, and bravery shaped the course of events in ways that mere numbers could never predict.